I think I want to ask you a little bit on the new developments on US-Russia relationship. And there was a time when a lot of people, including people like Jeffrey Sachs, thought that Trump seriously wants peace with Russia. So my first question is, do you think Trump seriously wants peace with Russia? If yes, why is it? Because a lot of people says it is to delink Russia from China and maybe even Iran. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's no question that Trump wants peace with Russia. He wants to end the Ukraine war. Whether he can do it is another matter. We can talk about that. Your question is why? I think there are a variety of reasons. First of all, he understands that we've lost.
Right.
It's time to cut our losses. Furthermore, he understands that from Ukraine's point of view, it would make good sense to end this war rather than continue it. Because if we continue the war, more Ukrainians will die and they'll lose more territory. Third, I think he believes quite correctly that Russia is not a serious threat to the United States. Indeed, it's not a serious threat to Europe. And fourth, I think he believes that there are all sorts of advantages to working with Putin, which you described, which is that if you're interested in shutting down the Iran nuclear program, getting some sort of agreement with the Iranians, it would help to have cooperative relations or good relations with the Russians so that they could cooperate and help you in this endeavor. And in terms of dealing with China, although it's probably not possible at this point in time, given the bad blood between us and the Russians that has existed for so long now, but it would be good to try to have better relations with the Russians and peel them away at least somewhat from China. Maybe get the Russians not to be allied with the United States or linked with the United States, but at least get the Russians to be neutral, to sit on the fence, try to do that. And I think that's one of his goals. I think that will be extremely hard to do. But I think those reasons explain what's going on here. And I think they're all good reasons. I think Trump's instincts on the Ukraine war and on U.S.-Russian relations and on how we should deal with Putin are basically correct. Right. I think his instincts on a lot of other issues are terrible. But on this one, I think he's on the money.
I think then the million-dollar question is, why is he so helpless and unable to move forward? I guess I remember about 2 weeks ago when we chatted last, and I asked at that point in time, Professor Mearsheimer, do you think the April 20 ceasefire can work? Because it seems like it's not working. And your response was there ever a ceasefire? Would you please explain what you meant and why is it not working then?
Well, let me just talk about why he's not been able to come close to getting an agreement and then talk about the ceasefire. The problem that Trump faces is that the Russian demands are hard to swallow. The Russians insist that Ukraine cannot be in NATO. And indeed, there can be no security guarantee between the West, especially the United States, and Ukraine, because that's like de facto NATO membership. So that's the first Russian demand. Second Russian demand is that Ukraine has to give up at least the 4 oblasts that Russia has annexed and Crimea, which Russia has annexed. And then the third demand is that these are the major demands. The third demand is that Ukraine has to demilitarize to the point where it has no offensive military. It has no capability to threaten Russia militarily. Basically is not an offensive military threat to Russia. So that would involve substantially disarming, not completely disarming, but substantially disarming Ukraine. Those are the 3 demands. And Trump has to swallow them. And he's not been able to do that.
Not even the first one, because Pete Hegseth had said that there is no question that Ukraine shouldn't be in NATO. So Trump doesn't swallow it.
He appears to have swallowed that. He appears to even have swallowed the one on territory, right? But he has to explicitly swallow all three of them. He has to say, these demands are demands that I accept. He may do it, but he has not done it yet. He's hinted at that. So until he does that, you have no overarching peace agreement, which is really what the Russians want, and I believe Trump wants. But you also don't want to underestimate the extent to which the Europeans, the Ukrainians themselves, and a huge chunk of the Western elite is adamantly opposed to Trump even negotiating with the Russians, much less accepting Russian demands. So he has his work cut out for him. And he's not exactly a Machiavelli, right? You need a Machiavelli here to make this work. Somebody who's really smooth, really sophisticated, like Lyndon Johnson in his heyday. And that is not Donald Trump. He is the anti-Machiavelli. So that's the general peace agreement. You ask about the ceasefire. Well, they had these negotiations, right, to get a ceasefire. What the Americans and the Ukrainians wanted was an overarching ceasefire. They wanted to shut the war down temporarily, an overarching or comprehensive ceasefire. The Russians have made it clear there is not going to be a comprehensive ceasefire until we reach an agreement. Until we reach an agreement where you accept our three principal demands. Why? Because the Russian military is on the move. They're winning. They'd be crazy to agree to a ceasefire. To let the Ukrainians, reconstitute their forces, rearm, makes no sense. So no comprehensive ceasefire. The Russians and the Americans, working on the side with the Ukrainians, did craft what looked like two ceasefire agreements, one involving the Black Sea and the other involving attacks on energy infrastructure in both countries. The one regarding the Black Sea has never been formalized, so there is just no agreement there, no ceasefire there. We can go into the details if you want. And then with regard to the ceasefire involving energy infrastructure, the Ukrainians have been violating that on a daily basis. So it's a meaningless ceasefire. It was only a 30-day ceasefire anyway. So you had these two small ceasefire agreements, one of which never resulted, and the second one, which in effect never resulted. So you have no ceasefire. And you're not going to get a ceasefire because the ceasefire that you really need is a comprehensive one. And you won't get that until you get a general agreement for a peace deal.
During the announcement about the tariffs, I didn't see Russia being named there. And please correct me if I'm wrong. One of the conditions on one of those partial ceasefires, I guess it was on the Black Sea, was Russia saying that one of the conditions should be our access to international markets, especially of fertilizers and food, which would also mean to revoke the sanctions of their agricultural banks through the SWIFT system. Do you think Trump might be willing to take all these sanctions back?
Trump is. It's the Europeans who wouldn't do that. You're right. The Russians said, with regard to the Black Sea ceasefire, that it was necessary for the main Russian bank to be able to engage in economic intercourse, which meant taking the sanctions off and have access to the SWIFT system as well. And the Europeans said, no, can't do that. So the Europeans and Trump were at loggerheads, and the Europeans won. And therefore, the Black Sea Agreement never went into play.
So would it be fair to say that Europe is now one of the biggest impediments to the normalization talks?
Yes, I put it a bit more specifically. I'd say that the biggest impediment are the Ukrainians themselves.
Right.
And right behind them in second place are the Europeans. With some exceptions like Viktor Orban and Hungary. But your basic point is, of course, correct.
My final question on Ukraine, Professor Mearsheimer, I guess you have spoken about it, but I think it's important, and if you can take a sip of water as I speak. You have mentioned about the color revolution earlier in this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about how you see has been the impact of, or let's say how you would define Western Ukrainian nationalism, and does it have any, whether strategic or moral or political, any legitimacy in the larger scheme of things that we are discussing?
I think there's no question that Ukrainian nationalism is a remarkably powerful force. And I think one of the principal reasons that the Ukrainians have continued to fight against the Russian war machine, despite suffering enormous casualties, is because of nationalism. Their commitment to the country, to the motherland, to the fatherland, their commitment to fighting is truly impressive.
No, I guess I didn't frame it well. I was thinking about the change in nature of Ukrainian nationalism since 2004, then again in 2010, and of course very massively since 2014. That kind of a shift towards the far right. I mean, of course, there was a Ukrainian nationalism which was not necessarily as hostile. I mean, there was a section of that which was, of course, remarkably hostile to Russia from the very beginning.
But nationalism has been there from the beginning. If you go back to 1991, the nationalism has been there.
Of course.
What you're talking about is where the political center of gravity is.
Right.
It's a somewhat different issue. You could argue that as Ukraine has moved to the right, that nationalism has become more virulent, and it's a more virulent form of nationalism. You can make that argument. But there's no question that Ukraine has moved to the right.
And that generates a lot of contradiction in the East. And that's something I thought is important in this regard. Because as Ukrainian nationalism shifted towards right, contradictions in Eastern Europe got intensified, and the Russians perhaps have bigger incentives to intervene.
Yeah, I mean, it really this problem breaks out into the open. It's festering below the surface for sure, but it breaks out into the open in 2014. In February 2014, you have the Maidan Revolution, and Viktor Yanukovych, who is the leader of Ukraine, is effectively overthrown, and he is pro-Russian, and he ends up actually going to Russia. And then the leadership that takes over ends up instituting a series of laws involving language that people in Eastern Ukraine can use. And of course, in Eastern Ukraine, you have lots of ethnic Russians and lots of Russian speakers. So a conflict shortly after the February 4, 2014 crisis breaks out, a conflict starts in the East, an armed conflict. You effectively have a civil war in the East. It involves ethnic Russians and lots of Russian speakers on one side, and on the other side you have basically ethnic Ukrainians, and that's an ongoing conflict.